And when I became interested in these favorites of yours and began to observe and study their strange psyche, I finally understood why and to what ends great nature herself and the most high and most saintly individuals are always patiently adapting themselves to all things. In this connection, the following personal opinion was formed in me. If only these favorites of yours would seriously ponder all this and serve nature honestly in this respect, their being self-perfecting might then proceed automatically, even without the participation of their consciousness, and in any case, the poor nature of this ill-fated planet would not have to strain so hard to adapt herself to remain within the common cosmic harmony. But to the misfortune of everything existing in the megalocosmos, there is no honesty in your favorites in fulfilling their duties, not even toward that nature to whom, in truth, they owe their very existence. As regards the absence of honesty in your favorites in the fulfillment of their duty toward nature, I have just remembered a very wise saying of our incomparable teacher Mullah Nasruddin, the hidden meaning of which is borne out in the present case. Plague and cholera are in any event nobler than human honesty, for people with a conscience can at least live at peace with them. And so, my dear Hassing, when it became clear that there had entirely disappeared from the psyche of your favorites the instinctive need for conscious labor and intentional suffering in order to take in and transmute in themselves the sacred substances of rustness and healthiness, thus releasing the sacred Askican for the maintenance of the moon and Anulius, great nature was constrained to adapt herself and to extract this sacred substance by other means, one of them being precisely that periodic terrifying process of reciprocal destruction, that is, wars. Here, for a correct valuation of your contemporary favorites, it will be opportune to remind you that after the organ Kundabafur had been removed from the three brain beings of your planet, the first generations of their descendants very soon learned that a certain substance had to be transformed through them and that their assistance in this transformation was one of their chief being duties. Do you remember, I already told you that the three brain beings of the continent of Atlantis even considered this being duty as sacred and called it Emerlus, which in their language meant help for the moon. And so the beings of that period, which was then called the Samliasian civilization, devised and very scrupulously practiced certain customs that contributed to the fulfillment of those being duties in the most effective way. These beings of the continent of Atlantis even devised a wise and practical means of fulfilling these two being duties, namely, the duty of perfecting their higher bodies and the duty of serving the most great cosmic Trigoatobacrat by uniting them into a one and performing them simultaneously. And they accomplished this union in the following way. In every region, and even in the separate districts of the regions, three special, very imposing buildings were required to be built. 1. For the beings of the male sex, was called Agorachrostini. The second building, reserved for beings of the female sex, was called Gynecochrostini. The third, for beings then called the middle sex, was called Anaroparianikima. The first two of these imposing buildings were considered sacred by the beings of the continent of Atlantis, representing for them what temples, churches, chapels, and other sacred places are for the contemporary beings of the earth. When I descended for the first time on that planet to the continent of Atlantis, I myself visited certain of these buildings and thus became well acquainted with their purpose. In the temples for men, namely in the Agorachrostinus, beings of the male sex of the given region or district performed in turn appropriate mysteries, while in a particular state called self-remembering. The beings of the continent of Atlantis had the definite idea that beings of the male sex are sources of active manifestation, and hence in their agorachrustiness they devoted their whole time to active and conscious contemplation, and in this state performed these corresponding sacred mysteries, so that there should be transmuted in them the sacred substances of brusqueness and healthiness. And they did this intentionally and with full consciousness in order that the sacred substance liberated in them, and issuing through their emanations for its further vivifyingness, should become the active part in that sacred law which they call the Holy Trinity. In the sacred gynecochrustiness, reserved for the beings of the female sex, every woman was obliged to remain during certain periods that contemporary beings call menstruation. Moreover, the women, acknowledging themselves as passive beings, had to be passive during the whole time of their stay there, so that the substance issuing through their emanations should serve as the passive part of that same sacred law for its further vivifyingness. Hence they passed the whole time in these gynecochrustiness in a state of complete passivity, trying consciously not to think about anything. With this aim in view, they tried to have no active experiencings during their monthly periods, and in order that the flow of associations should not hinder them from concentrating, everything was arranged so that their thoughts should be directed the whole time to wishing for the well-being of their present or future children. And as regards the buildings of the third kind, which were called anaropary and ocumus, they were erected, as I already told you, for the beings belonging to what was then called the middle sex, whom our Molinasradin would call misunderstandings or beings who are neither one thing nor the other. Among these beings of the middle sex were some of the male sex and some of the female sex. These were beings who, for various reasons, no longer had the possibility either of perfecting themselves or of serving nature. They were, as our dear Molinasradin puts it in one of his sayings, neither a candle for an angel, nor a poker for the devil. Beings of the male sex were secluded in these houses for a certain time who, for some reason or other, were wholly deprived of the possibility of conscious contemplation, and beings of the female sex were secluded who either did not menstruate at all, or in whom menstruation occurred abnormally, as were also those women who with regard to their sexual desires became transformed at certain periods into what are called kenyaminous or, as our dear Mola would say, into veritable mares in springtime. The beings of the continent of Atlantis of that time were familiar with several definite bizarre symptoms by which these beings were recognized and confined in the anaropary and ocumus. These symptoms could be recognized by the following particularities. 1. If a being believed in all sorts of balderdash. 2. If he began proving to others something he knew absolutely nothing about, or was not quite sure of. 3. If he failed to keep his word of honor, or took an oath in vain. 4. And finally, if he showed a tendency to spy on others and to be occupied with Tuksukef. But the most conclusive symptom of all was the appearance in a being of what was then called moyasal, which your contemporary favorites consider as an illness and call hemorrhoids,